We're good to go. So when I was preparing for this talk, I last minute decided it might be a good idea to include some little helpers here, just in case you don't laugh at my jokes and you think they're bad. I have a little unicorn here to remind you to laugh and then also to clap. So that was a clap situation. OK, so I'm here to talk to you about CSS, the past, the present, and the future. I've got a lot to cover, so I'm just going to kind of get right into it. And before I get into the code, I do want to give you a little bit of background. If you like this stuff, if you like hearing about CSS or JavaScript or experimentation on the web, you should follow me on Twitter. It's just @UNA. I also have a blog in which I share a lot of these experiments and some of the things that I'm working with. I work at Bustle Digital Group. I'm the director of product design. It's a really fun job. We get to do a lot of different experimentation on the web. We get to play with layouts, and we have 4 different publications that are all focused on millennial women. And I also have a podcast called Tools Day, which focuses on developer tools. It's a podcast about tech tips, tricks, and tools on Tuesdays at 2 p.m. every other week, so check that out as well. So we're going to start into this journey in the past, the CSS of the past. And let's just close our eyes for a second and open them to see the images. We're going back to a time when Jennifer Aniston and Matthew Perry were the most qualified technical educators on the market. A time when these were modern web browser icons. A time when we would use image mapping to create links in images. Does anyone remember those days, the Dreamweaver days? Yeah. I'm gonna, Those were good days. And we had a lot of CSS hacks back in those days. We had to really kind of work around the current platform that we had available to us. One of the things that was available was browser targeting. So, for example, to make things available in Chrome and Opera's earlier versions, you could do this bracket hack. If you wanted things available or a certain style just in Internet Explorer 6 and 7, you could use this asterisk hack. There's these massive lists of hacks that people have put together that I was just blown away by and astonished by when I was looking at this stuff earlier. Here's an example by Paul Irish, which has just a really big list of CSS hacks and shows you which browsers they match in and which ones they don't match in. We don't have to do that anymore because we have @supports. And @supports allows us to target individual properties instead of trying to do these weird hacks around browsers. @supports is very well supported in most browsers. You can see here that the support is pretty far. That wasn't even a laugh moment, but I appreciate it. Yeah, so if you want to use @supports, you can just pretty much say @supports and then the value that you want to support. So say I want to do @supports grid here. I would just do @supports display grid. And then you can say everything inside of there is going to be applied only on browsers that support that property. So obviously here, since it's not supported by Internet Explorer, you do have to use some fallbacks. Make sure that all of your users that you are supporting get some kind of user experience. I believe that user experience does not have to be identical on all platforms, but it should be a good user experience on all platforms. There's also this null transform hack where we would do translate z of 0 or translate 3D 000. And here, this is great because it composites the layers together whenever you're doing animation on the web, which means that we are using GPU acceleration instead of the CPU, and that allows for much smoother animations. You're not getting those janky animations. And layers get their own backing surface. So if you're doing flips and everything, it kind of works as you would expect. Otherwise, you might have some jank. There are some caveats to this, though. It does use more memory, so you are using memory and battery power from your users. And also, sometimes items appear more pixelated. So now, instead of this null transform hack, you can use the will change property. And you don't have to use transform to be stating what's going to happen. With will change, you just specify which properties are going to be animated so that you could use that GPU acceleration and get all of the benefits that you would from the null transform hack. But that also means that you also get all the caveats. So again, remember the memory and the battery usage is something that you want to be cognizant of when you're developing for your users. Will change is a progressive enhancement. So even though it's not supported in all browsers, your users that it is supported on will get the benefits of it, and browsers that it's not supported on are not going to see much of a visual difference. They're just not going to get the benefits of that GPU acceleration that those browsers that support will change would otherwise get. ClearFix. Does anybody remember ClearFix? That's all I have to say. Beware of floats. This is something that I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with. I remember I had to deal with this a ton when I was getting into web development, not even that long ago. And people would have to override these layout styles. They would do a break where they would clear both, or they would do overflow hidden on a parent to make rows work properly and not overflow each other. This is memories, guts. But we've grown a lot since then. And I want to talk about the CSS of the present now. Look at those beautiful presents. CSS of the present really is a present. And the first present I want to talk about is CSS Grid. CSS Grid is so, so, so powerful. We're now able to truly mimic print layouts and create even more robust layouts on the web. These examples are by Jules Forrest, and I really adore her work with CSS Grid experiments. I have her blog listed at the top right there. And what she does is she takes examples from the real world, will photocopy them, and then recreate them with CSS Grid. So the one on the left is a photocopy. The one on the right is just all done in the browser with Grid. This is another example from an article layout. There's an example of a newspaper here. You can do all of this with menus, and everything that you're putting in here gets the benefit of SEO. It gets the benefit of being searchable and findable on your page. So you're not just placing images now. You can really create content in a way that's native to the browser that looks unique and looks interesting, and people will give you benefits for that. If you're creating a web experience that people enjoy, they'll stay on that site longer. Grid is also my preferred way now of just designing and making layouts. A great example is Grid Template. So here you can see with Grid Template, I'm just listing out the entire layout of this area. And I'm using Grid Area to then say, I want the header to be where the smileys are. So I have the header where the smileys are. I have this gallery. I have this sidebar. You can even, literally in the browser, just restyle your entire layout. I like using emoji just as an example because it shows you a single unit placement across the grid, and you can visualize what that grid looks like for yourself. And also you can change all of these values. So these can be pixel values, they could be fractional units. Fractional units take up a certain amount of space. I'll show that in a second. They could be any value. You can also have auto to auto-fit the remaining space of that grid. Grid is super powerful and gives designers and developers a lot of control over layouts that we never had before. And it's very well supported, luckily. You can also do fun things like this with Grid, where you can just type whatever you want inside of a bar. Let's go ahead. I hit a key. And it appears, and the lines around it will sort of form to it. So what's happening here is this. We have this auto section. So again, you could type whatever you want in there. And then the sides around those, the template columns around those, are one fractional unit. So each of those is taking one fractional unit of the remaining space that's not being aligned to that auto area. And in just a couple of lines of code, we can have something that's really dynamic. You can animate the stuff. You can really start to get creative with Grid. And it's just starting to really be seen on the web more. So right now is the time to experiment and to discover these sorts of things and to play with these technologies yourself. Like I said earlier, support is relatively good. It's supported in all the modern browsers. IE does use an older implementation of Grid, so you do have to be careful there because you might see some differences. So it's really important to browser test, especially when you're using Grid. But definitely go and use it today. I think it's pretty much ready. If you do want to use it today and have to support IE users, I made a small website called grid2flex.com where you can get Flexbox fallbacks for Grid examples for some common patterns. And I'm just starting that, so I'm going to keep growing it with more examples. But it is available there if you do have to have Flexbox fallbacks for IE users. The next thing I want to talk about are custom properties. CSS custom properties, also known as CSS variables, are really exciting because we finally have true dynamic variables in CSS. Unlike Sass, where you had a variable that you would write once and then it was permanent, it was affixed to that value, with these, it's very dynamic. So here I could just change the color whenever I want. You can even access these with JavaScript, which means that you can apply JavaScript values to your DOM here. So you can use physics, you can use anything that you want. So what I'm going to do here, and zoom in, I'm going to access the property name, so I'm going to say color primary, and I'm going to set it to blue, and then it's just an example of how instantly with JavaScript you can see that change update. So you can use libraries for this. I've seen some really interesting creative animations done by using these custom properties and using JavaScript to push values into CSS. It's like JS in CSS, if you will. I think it's a really great feature, and I'm super excited to see how this interacts and plays more with some of the other things that are now available for CSS. The support is pretty good. You're going to see this chart basically all day during my talk. But what can we do? It's the web. The next thing I want to talk about are CSS filters. How many of you have heard of or played with CSS filters? All right, so that's like maybe a third of you. CSS filters are really exciting because they're super dynamic and they make a big impact with a little bit of code. So here I have an example where I'm just using the blur filter. These filters are all interoperable, which means that they change values from one to the other. And that means that they're animatable too. So there's blur, there's brightness, there's contrast. You can even decrease contrast by making it less than 1. So I can make this 0.5 and it dulls the image down. I can set the hue rotate, which is a fun one. And you can rotate it on any direction of the color wheel. So now I'm changing the color of this. I'm going to get rid of this contrast because it looks crazy. There's brightness. You can increase the brightness by making it value greater than 1. You can decrease the brightness by making it a value less than 1. A lot of these are great to use together. You can list them out. Another one that you can use is SVG filters. So you can now access SVG filters from CSS. You just have to have the URL, and here I have one called glitch. And that's just me having an SVG filter, so it's an SVG with a turbulence filter applied to it that I can then access with CSS. The thing about the SVG filters is they are not interoperable, so you cannot animate them through CSS. You can animate them through JavaScript, but you can't, like I was doing earlier with the little transition between those filters, you can't apply that to the SVG filters. But filters are really dynamic, not only for images, which is something that I've seen them used a lot for, but also for other elements inside of your UI. So these are just some icon elements. Now, with these icon elements, I'm trying to change the color. Maybe I just want to have one icon and use it in multiple places and have different colors applied to these icons. You can do that by using CSS filters. Right here, I'm trying to set the hue rotate, but it's not doing anything yet. And that's because I have to do a couple of other things first. This is like a fun little filter trick that I like to use. You can use sepia to set the values to become more of a yellow color and set those to 1. You're still probably not seeing a lot of color change. But then if I go through and I saturate this, you'll start to see that vibrant color change. Now I can go through and change this hue to anything I want. So I can, I'm just going to rewrite it at the end here. I can make this like -50 degrees, and it's a lighter orange. I can make it 150 degrees. It's blue. So I can access any SVG element, like icons, like text, and change the colors of those just directly by using a single line of code, and that's the CSS filter. I think that's a really powerful thing to do. You only have to have one asset and have it be in as many colors as you want. And this is especially useful if you're using SVGs that you're injecting as background images, because that way you can't access the fill color of the SVG itself. You're going to have to do this instead of being able to access the native properties of that SVG. You can also apply this to text, as I was saying earlier. And this specific trick sort of reminds me of the Sass color functions that I used to know and love back in the day that I used Sass all the time. And these are just some of the examples of the Sass color functions that were available when you downloaded and used any version of Sass. So there's lighten, darken, adjust hue, and saturate. And like I showed you a second ago, you can get all of these by using filter. So you can apply filter for hover states, for differentiating text values, for block quotes, for any aspect of your UI that you need a little bit of color differentiation. It could be on images, it could be on UIs, headers, it could be on text. So really, this is a powerful thing that you can use anywhere. And it's even more powerful with blend modes, so I'm not going to get into blend modes because I just get too rattled about those. I get so excited. Filter effects are decently well supported. All the ones that are the primary ones I've showed you are supported on Edge. I haven't found any problems with those. Not supported on IE, so if you're going to do something like update your UI colors, like the icons, from white to another color, make sure that they're not in a white background, so your IE users will see your icons. That may or not have been something I messed up on. Let's talk about display contents. So who has heard of display contents? A few of you. This is a pretty new property that allows us to kind of go around some kind of annoying things. It allows us to not have to hack away parent styles. And it's easier to show you what I mean there. So in this example, we have these items that are wrapped in a Flex container, and then this item that's wrapped in its own class called multi-items. So what we're seeing here is that item, it breaks that parent layout, so it breaks that Flex layout. But if we apply display contents on it, it's going to then flow into the layout, so we don't have to reapply display Flex to that child element. Now I'll show you another example of what that's doing. So here we have this unordered list, and we have the bullet styles, the display as we would expect, those browser elements that come from the style sheet of the browser. But if we hit display contents on this, it's going to get rid of all of those layout styles. If we apply display contents to the list items, you're only going to see the content. So that's exactly what we're doing. We're getting rid of the parent layout styles, and we're just displaying the contents. It is what it sounds like. I think this example with list items really helps to demonstrate what this is doing. So that also helps to get rid of some of the hacks. So like I said, it's a brand new property. Pretty much only Firefox and Chrome support it. But as we're starting to use grid more, as we're starting to use subgrid more, this is something that can solve a lot of the hacky problems that people are starting to run up against. So next I want to talk about focus within. Focus within is a CSS pseudo property that is super, super helpful, especially in an example like I will show you. Focus within allows you to style an element when focus is trapped anywhere within it. So previously, if you used focus, you were only able to focus on the parent element, the element that you are directly focusing on, and not anything inside. So let's take this example with a little drop-down menu. If you drop down, you have your sub-menus, and you have everything kind of as you expect when you mouse over it, when you hover over it. But when you want to focus over it, if you're a keyboard user, you can't get into the content within that sub-menu because we're only able to focus on the parent element. And that's a real problem for a lot of users that use keyboards. For accessibility, this is a real concern. But with focus within, it kind of solves that because now we're able to style these elements based on its parent being focused. So when I tab through this, we can see it remaining open. And it's the exact same styling, but all I have done is applied focus within, along with where the hover was for the previous example. So again, with one line of code, CSS shows how powerful it is. It now allows us to create accessible experiences for people who are using keyboards to navigate. Focus within is not supported in Edge or IE, unfortunately, but it is supported in Firefox, Chrome, Safari. I do hope to see more support for this feature in the future because it is just so great for accessibility. It does bring that to the forefront. Also, the ability to style the focus ring is something that we're starting to see more and more support for, so that's something that I'm looking forward to for the web. I did write a post about this if you want to see more information, and that is at csstricks.com/solved-with-css-dropdown menus. It's a series I'm doing that's just examples of things that are solved with CSS by using pretty simple examples, pretty easy solutions for difficult problems on the web that just seem to keep popping up. So now let's talk about CSS of the future. This is where it gets really, really interesting. This is where the support charts start to look really red. But before we do, I think it's important to sort of understand W3C drafts and what they mean. I didn't know what these meant for a long time until I put some time into this research. An editor's draft is a working document by an individual or W3C editor or group. And then you have the working draft, which is published by the W3C for community review. So this is like a fixed point in time. Editor's drafts and working drafts often will coincide in existence. So the working draft will be the fixed point, and then editor's draft will be written that will then edit the working draft. There's also the candidate recommendation. That's a document that has been widely reviewed and satisfies the W3C's technical requirements, and it is then a proposed recommendation for web browsers. It goes through the advisory committee and becomes a W3C recommendation that becomes a web standard. So that's sort of how web standards happen. It's all just people writing notes about what they think will be best for the web. And they do a lot of great work. So I want to talk about variable fonts next. Variable fonts are really exciting. They allow us to have a lot of variance within a single typeface. So instead of downloading a lot of different font weights and different font property values, you can download one font, send your user one font, and have the ability to alter the weight, the width, a variety of values. And that definitely depends on the font itself. So here is one that allows to fit into the box. So you can change the weight, but you can also have that font sort of fit in this box. So you could have it kind of, it looks crazy. A lot of this stuff is definitely still in development, but there is a lot more content out there than a year ago, than even 6 months ago or 3 months ago. There's some great resources I'll share to find more. This is a really interesting example that I saw. This is a font called Muybridge, and it is an animation that's happening from a font. So you can animate these font variation settings, and that's what they're doing here. There's this keyframe called Gallop, and if we look at what's happening there, they're animating the font variation settings. So if I was to change this from 1,000 to, say, 500, you see that that's breaking the animation. So you can now animate things with fonts. Decovar is a really cool typeface that has all of these different properties. It has all these different ligatures and values, so you can change the skeleton of this font. You can change the terminal. I'm going to change the skeleton back to here. So you can get both serif fonts and sans serif fonts in a single typeface and a single download for your users. Like, that is so cool. And this is something that we're going to see more and more of in the future. Designers are thinking about performance. Developers are thinking about design. And I really like to see how a lot of these properties for CSS and for sort of design on the web are fusing those two mediums. Support it's iffy. So Firefox supports some of this stuff. It doesn't support color fonts. Color fonts are another thing that's sort of starting to erupt on the web. Chrome does, and Edge does support it. Awesome. Safari supports this. IE probably won't support this, but as this becomes something that is more common and regularly used on the web, I suspect that IE users will also kind of decrease a little bit. Two really great resources for more information are Axis Praxis and vfonts. Vfonts has this massive listing of fonts that you can just see every single example basically that exists for variable fonts and all of the different ways to adjust the variable options. So like you saw earlier with the end caps, with maybe an inline, maybe like a shadow, rotating the font is sometimes an option. Really, really fun to just kind of play with these on your own browsers and just dive in there. Text decoration is also a property that we can use today and play with today. So text decoration is the underline that we see on links for the most part. You can do a different color now for that text decoration property. So you can use aquamarine as the underline color. You can change the style of the text decoration. So you can do dashed, you can do dotted, you can do, I love this one, wavy. That's pretty cool. You can do double. There's just a wide variety of things you could do here. You could change where it's located. You can do an overline. So this is above the text. Line through is what we see with strikeout right here. But you can still apply these properties to it. I'm going to change this back to single and make this an underline. And you can also use text decoration skip ink, which magically skips the ink. So all those descenders will get skipped. So you no longer have to hack around this by making that text have an outline that matches the background color and applying a border bottom. You no longer have to do this. It is a single line of code. Thank you. Hold on. I didn't do that. The browsers did it, but I appreciate the applause anyway. So use this today because it works in most of these browsers. All the things I showed you do, and it's a progressive enhancement. If the browser doesn't support it, you'll get an underline. It's fine. So the next thing I want to talk about is image set, which is very, very cool, especially for you image performance nerds. So now we can finally apply different images as backgrounds in CSS. So you might be familiar with the picture element. With the picture element and source set, it allows us to send photos, images of different sizes based on the browser that you're sending the images to. So it'll query for if it's a retina or non-retina for the PPI. It'll query for the size, anything that you set it to. With image set, we can also query for if it's a non-retina or a retina image, and then only send retina images to retina users. If you're not doing that, it's a waste. So this screen back here is a non-retina screen. But with DevTools, you can change that. You can do laptop with high DPI, a laptop with medium DPI, and test this. So you can see that directly in DevTools, that you're sending a retina image for the high DPI laptops and a low retina, non-retina image for the lower laptops, saving in size and improving your user experience. So that's a really, really powerful thing to be hitting the browsers, to be something that we can do through CSS now, where you often want to be using this. Sometimes you don't want an inline image. Unfortunately, support's not awesome, but it's getting there. And also for all of these things, like, for example, Edge has a community where you can upvote if you really want support for this. Hopefully see more support for features like this in the future. Next thing I want to talk about is scroll snap. Scroll snap allows us to snap to various elements on our page. So this could be X or Y. You can have scroll padding. You can set the alignment. There is a great demo website that I'm going to open here to show you with scroll snapping examples. So here, this is an example of not having scroll snap. So as I scroll through, it's just kind of what you expect. There's that bar on the bottom. It's not really snapping to any point. When you do have scroll snap, if you don't scroll fast enough, it'll go back to the previous point. If you do get it past a certain point, it'll scroll and it'll snap to any of those points. So with scroll snap, it's not just something that you have to do vertically. You can set different sizes. You can really start to see different examples and placements for this. Here's an example that is just multiple directional centered space grid. And it does work a little bit differently in different browsers. Yeah, this is a rotated one. Get crazy now, CSS. There are sort of different frequencies of snap for different browsers, but this is something that I was really excited to see support for. When I first was putting this talk together, it wasn't supported in Chrome, and then it was, so that was pretty cool. But definitely something you can play with. It says it's under a flag, but this is a stable version of Chrome that does not have a flag, so evidence that you can use it in Chrome. Next thing I want to talk about are ambient light queries. This is sort of the ideal example here. I used to be able to zoom in, but I think that my computer was freaking out earlier, so I'm unable. But I'll just read out loud if you can't see in the back. Here we have at media light level dim. The idea is to be able to style this block based on your at media light level query. Now this isn't something that's currently available, but you can do this with JavaScript. You can apply an event listener for device light and set your light to a certain level. So I have here if light is less than 40 or if light is more than 1,000, I could style this differently. So an example would be if you have a device you're reading outside in a bright sunny day, maybe you need that text to be bigger and darker. If you're reading it at night in your bed with all the lights off, maybe you want a dark background and it not to be so in your face. So I'm going to open Firefox in this example and just kind of show, because it does work in Firefox. So here, if I open my phone and I apply a light to this, it's going to get much bigger and bolder. If I take that away, this is sort of like the standard level, and close that sort of light level with my finger, what it's supposed to do is turn black. But we saw this work for a second, so at least with that phone, it'll get bigger. So this I'm using sort of as an example of things that you can do but might not want to do. And support is pretty low. And I just want to highlight this. In Firefox, it's not going to be supported anymore. And the reason why is because of security concerns. If people have access to the device light in your camera, then they can have access to a lot more malicious things. And there are articles about why this is the idea on the web. So just because we can do it doesn't mean that we should do it. Things that are being considered for the web are definitely going through a heavy review process. Sometimes mistakes happen, and then we have to undo them. But overall, I like this idea that we're thinking outside the web and still being cautious about it. So the status of that is deferred to next draft. I don't think it'll, in this state, until we figure out the security issues, get put into the web again. But it might if we figure those things out. But other media queries that you can use, and you've been able to use these for a while now, since September 2017, you can use media queries for orientation. So portrait versus landscape on your phones and tablets, which is something that you might want for mobile design and development. You can set minimum resolutions. You can set different media queries for print. You can set media queries for projections. And color availabilities for projectors. I use a projector at home as my TV. I really like that. I can apply different styles based on that. You can use not. You can set it to monochrome, so things that aren't monochrome. You can apply different styles for people who do have monochrome in their browsers. Basically, the world is your oyster. Media queries have definitely been expanding over time. They're not just screen size anymore. OK, I want to talk about rhythmic sizing now. Rhythmic sizing is a fun one, especially for typography nerds. So rhythmic sizing allows us to snap our text to a baseline. And here is an example just right from the W3C draft that I'm using to show you all. So we have a grid that we're using custom properties to set. We're setting a line step height to that grid of 18 points. And here you see that that body text is now aligned to the grid. I don't know if you've ever been in elementary school and you had to print a paper, but all you had was lined paper. You didn't have nice printer paper. It never aligns to the grid. It never does. It's always all over the place. Maybe I'm the only one there. But here, with the line height step, you can set a grid and you can set everything to the baseline so it'll snap to that. In the second example with the header, what we're doing is we're setting 2 times that grid, but now we're seeing it centered on that grid value. So this can allow for a lot better vertical rhythm control for the typography of our websites. It's currently in a working draft status, so it'll be a little bit of a while till we see that in browsers today, but it is nice to keep an eye on. Support is very questionable. It wasn't even on Ken I use. I had to get this from MDN. So maybe just watch out for that. OK, so conic gradients is the next thing I want to talk about. Like I said, there's going to be a ton of topics in this. Conic gradients is exactly what I just showed. Leah Veru did some talks a couple years ago about conic gradients and their uses, like pie charts. She made this polyfill for them. All these great examples and uses for conic gradients. We don't currently have this today, but browser support. It's pretty bleak. It isn't a flag in Chrome, which is cool. However, do not fear, my friends, because we have Houdini. Who here has heard of Houdini? Oh, not enough of you. Houdini is the coolest thing that's ever happened to CSS. It is going to, people are always what's the future of CSS? It's not CSS and JS, it's Houdini. It's Houdini. Essentially, what Houdini does is it allows us, for the first time ever, to have access to the CSS object model. So JS polyfills we can use to style websites with. We use JavaScript to style websites all the time. We do have access to the Cascade layout pane composite, but we don't have access to the CSS object model. With Houdini, you're able to create these styles that you can use through CSS, which allows for more performant development, for more performant builds of your browsers. It allows for a better experience for designers and for people who are working with CSS too. It's really cool. Like, this is something that we've never had before, and we're just starting to see this come to life. So I want to talk about that. Another benefit of Houdini is that it normalizes cross-browser differences. So if something doesn't work in, say, Edge, and Edge supports Houdini, then you can apply a fix through Houdini. It's not even a polyfill. It's something that you can use through CSS to apply those features to that browser. You don't have to wait on those browsers to implement new features. So we're no longer reliant on browser vendors to create new CSS properties for us. We can write a worklet in Houdini, share that, and you can use it anywhere. That supports Houdini. That's so cool. OK, so there's a website called ishoudiniready.com. It's a great resource that shows the current availability of Houdini on different platforms. So right now, there's a few different APIs that are sort of in the works. The Paint API is the one that has been around for the longest and works sort of best. I'm going to be showing that in Chrome. There's also the Layout API, that's a work in progress, Parser API, Properties and Values API, the Animation Worklet, the Typed Object Model, and then the Font Metrics API. So just a variety of different things that we can use to write worklets and have access to. Now let's take a look at an example. So here is an example from the webs. Oh, yeah, I got it. OK. So what we're doing here is essentially we're using JavaScript to write these worklets and to register paints. What we're doing is we're creating these sort of boxes that are used as like placeholder, like for placements. And we are just saying like draw from the top to the bottom, take the size of the context, and then register the paint as a placeholder box. So with CodePen, this is a CodePen example. It's kind of janky. You have to import this as like a worklet file, as a module. It's like a workaround. But you wouldn't have to do this if you were using it through a browser anyway, if you had a server. Once you've done that, you can just use it with a single line of code in CSS. You would say paint placeholder box. And placeholder box is exactly what we just registered and exported here. And so with all of these boxes, it's going to get that paint style. And that's using the Paint API. Here is another example that I was playing around with. I am not great at Canvas, but I was like, let's give it a go, because why not? I made this thing called rainbow ties. And I was just playing with colors based on the context size. And it's drawing boxes that's surrounding this text. I, again, went and registered it. And then in CSS, all I'm doing is I'm setting the background image to paint rainbow ties. It's able to pull that in from JavaScript. Another thing you can do is truly set values. So here's an example of trying to animate and transition gradients right now in the browser. When you use Houdini, you can register different properties for each of these values. So what I'm doing here is I'm registering these two color stops as colors, inheriting from the color syntax, and then using custom properties to set those color values. So it's going from hot pink to red, and then it's changing here when you hover. I'm changing the values of those CSS variables, the CSS custom properties, when I'm hovering here. So because I registered them as individual paint properties that pull from color, I can now hover over this, and those individual properties will animate, and they will interpolate like you kind of want when you are hovering over gradients to animate. And gradients are just so hot right now on the web. Next example I want to show you is something that's like a bad idea. It's like, just because you do have this power doesn't mean that you should use it all the time. I'm painting like thousands of dots here. And there's a Chrome bug right now where it's actually repainting it when I like scroll for some reason occasionally. It's not supposed to do that. But this is still going to take a lot of processing power and like ruin your user's experience if you do this. So use with caution. Like with great power comes great responsibility. Here's a cool example by Will Boyd, and he was one who did the example before with the boxes, where you can just really have access to like things you wouldn't have before. The worklet file is pretty simple, again, just kind of creating this dot spacing, using this get and setting of the CSS custom properties. super, super powerful that we can now transition from JavaScript to CSS. Oh, it's just so cool. There's a great website. This is like the best website I found about Houdini examples, and it's lab.imvdo.me. And here it just shows a lot of different examples of using various Houdini properties, like corner radius, right? Like, who would have thought, you know? There's just so many things that you can do with this. There's a really cool example. There's like, you could do ripple animations as using the animation work that I didn't really talk about. This one is super cool, the SVG path layout. I have to switch to Canary to show that one. So I'm going to just go to the same little spot here. So here, what he did was created this path that allowed you to move the other elements based on this line. Like, how freaking cool is that? This is so cool. Don't clap for me. I literally didn't make this. I'm just showing it to you. But like, with some of these worklets, with some of these different Houdini properties, we really have so much control over the visual look and feel of our websites. And that's why I think that Houdini is 100% the future of how we'll be writing CSS. It's so, so cool. It just gives us so much power. So I wanted to sprinkle that on you. Also, a couple of other things to check out are the fill and stroke properties, especially if you're into SVG and designing with SVG. That kind of determines how things are getting filled. Color level 4, we have lab color coming out, a lot of different options there for colors, selectors level 4. Lots of drafts are available at drafts.csswg.org. If you're curious and just kind of want to like see what's coming up, I think this is a cool thing to do, but I'm a weirdo. But I hope that you're as excited about CSS as I am. It's the future, man. That's all I have for you. Thank you.